Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nat Chat. I'm Nat Eliason, and in this episode, I'm interviewing Aaron Watson. Aaron got introduced to me via Zak Slayback, who came on for episode 25, because Aaron is another person in the Pittsburgh scene who is working in this whole education, self-improvement space, and who cares a lot about the problems that we've been talking about on this podcast. Aaron graduated from the University of Pittsburgh and went straight into a insurance sales job with Northwestern Mutual. Pretty quickly into it, he realized that it wasn't really for him, and he wanted to leave and start a podcast instead. He's been doing that for 2 years now. He's done over 250 episodes. It's one of his main focuses, along with being a professional ultimate Frisbee player and running head of branding for another internet entrepreneur. And he's just had a really interesting experience going through college, doing a lot of the normal stuff, and then realizing it wasn't for him and breaking away and doing something that fit his interests much better. If that describes you, if you've ever thought about, I don't really love this job, I want to go do something else that I'm more excited about, Aaron's a perfect model of how you can do that. And he talks all about some of the struggles getting that started in the beginning, what he went through, how he figured out how to do it throughout the episode. I think it'll be really valuable for anyone who falls into that camp. And even if you don't, Aaron's a really cool guy. He had a lot to say. And be sure you also check out his podcast, Going Deep with Aaron, and that you check out the conference he's hosting in Pittsburgh on January 27th, where Zak Slayback will also be speaking. And he's got a coupon code for that too, which he mentions towards the end of the episode. So without further ado, let's welcome Aaron to the show. Aaron, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you on.
Nat, it is an honor, my man.
Dude, this is going to be a really fun conversation because we got introed through Zak Slayback, who was one of the most recent guests on the show. And, he had really great things to say about you and what you're up to in Pittsburgh. And so, I'm just excited to talk about this. So when you run into someone in Pittsburgh, like cocktail party or whatever, how do you introduce yourself? What do you say you're working on?
The main pitch is always I host a podcast, Going Deep with Aaron Watson. We've done 250 episodes, been downloaded in more than 122 countries. And then from that point, it splinters based off of what little I know about the person I'm speaking with. So there's a couple of subsections of the show. We've gone deep into blockchain technology, entrepreneurship, writing, specifically just kind of power players in the city of Pittsburgh, or the world of finance. And I kind of tailor it. And, these are the guests that I've had on, or these are the things we've discussed based upon who I'm speaking with.
What makes you pick a new topic to talk about on the show?
I just think about it in terms of, I'm an only child, and I think about it in terms of what do I wish I had a big brother teaching me? I think it would be pretentious to say like an uncle or like a father, because I'm 25 years old. That's not really appropriate, but I feel like I could be a lot of people's big brother who kind of gives them some guidance and some perspective and basically just speak to an older version of myself. Like, what should I have known about when I was, 19, 20, 21 that I've put together now and can hopefully leverage and find a shortcut in those roles of thinking.
And you said 250 episodes, right? So when did you start it?
Basically just over 2 years ago. I've been pretty much trying to pump out 2 per week. There's been a few single episode weeks, obviously off for some holidays and whatnot, but my whole philosophy there, and this goes back to work ethic learned from my parents and what I've applied to winning 2 ultimate Frisbee national championships, is just trying to outwork the other people that are out there. A lot of shows are once a month or every other week or once a week. And I know that there's some people who do like a daily episode, and that's something I aspire to eventually. But the whole notion is if I can, have a higher production rate, I'm going to learn from my mistakes more quickly. I am going to just basically get more reps. And 5 years down the road, I'm going to be at a place that a peer that is, at a lower rate and maybe not working as hard as me won't be able to reach.
Where do you think, or where did that drive come from? Because like you said, most people are doing it once a week. I'm doing it once a week, right?
Yeah. I'm not trying to talk trash or anything, but it's just my competitive nature comes out when I talk about that. And it's really, in my childhood, I was smart enough that elementary school, junior high, all that stuff, it wasn't really hard. Like I could just kind of show up and, get passable grades, if not higher, without really putting that much into it. And my parents realized that. So they were, looking for different ways to challenge me outside the classroom. And the story, we're all so affected by the stories of our parents or whoever's, your role models and father and mother figures. And, both of my parents came from lower income situations. My mom, just growing up in the era that she did, she surpassed a lot of the expectations that were put in place for a woman in terms of her career. My dad, put himself through school and was, you could say, like the guy from his neighborhood that made it, or one of the guys from his neighborhood that made it. And that story and that ethos of working hard, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If someone's working harder than you, I've applied to everything and seen it manifest itself in success for the first real time with Ultimate Frisbee. Like I mentioned before, I was the captain of the University of Pittsburgh's Ultimate Frisbee team. We won national championships in 2012, 2013, and have played semi-professionally for the Pittsburgh Thunderbirds. And the only reason, there were guys that were better throwers than me who had been playing longer, but I spent more time in the gym. I worked harder on the track. I was getting more reps in at practice when other people were getting water. And that manifested itself in starting in the first college championship that was ever streamed on ESPN3 or whatever their online streaming platform is. And, that's a pretty big cultural moment for the Ultimate Frisbee community. And that was purely a byproduct of the work that I put in. It had nothing to do with my natural talent.
It's pretty impressive because, like you said, it's not an area that you hear about as much, like National Frisbee. And so getting it into that, more of that national view, like clearly it's got to feel good, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you don't do it for that reason. You do it because you love to play the game and you love the competition of it. But it always, that's what I kind of hang my hat on. And I saw it also manifest itself in the culture of the team and other people, matching that and coming with that same level of intensity. And that's where the real magic happens.
So how are you balancing your schedule then? Because you've got this professional competitive team sport, you've got the podcast, and then you're also running branding for Nathan Laka, right?
Right. So in general, it's not really thinking about things in the normal 9 to 5, 40-hour work week paradigm. If I am watching Monday Night Football or something, it's with my email open, or it's as I'm editing a podcast episode and then kind of watching the thing in the background. And that to me is just kind of the sacrifice of being able to have access to opportunities later on in life that other people won't be able to. So, from a training standpoint, that season's over. So I'm not necessarily doing as much with the Ultimate Frisbee side of things right now. But in general, it's just being willing to put in that extra work. There's plenty of hours in the day if you're focusing on just a few things.
Yeah. What have been some of the biggest lessons from doing the podcast and having talked to now 250 people?
So you can kind of split that into two buckets, right? So there's the personal skills that I've developed, which is being a better listener, the value of being prepared for an interview. That's something you're also really good at. And I listened to the Zak Slayback interview that you mentioned, and
Thank you.
It's very clear that you're well prepared, and that translates into a better interview, a better conversation, and just trying to eliminate the verbal tics. I've left my old episodes up, and there's ums and uhs and awkward pauses and likes and verbal tics, and I haven't fixed all of those. But they're significantly improved after 250 episodes. At least I would hope so. From listening to yourself as you're editing and all this other stuff, you start to get some perspective on the reality of where you are versus where you want to be. And then in terms of the interviews, it's that traditional piece of advice is that nothing happens overnight. So one of kind of the first breakthrough interview I had was with a finance writer and advisor named Barry Ritholtz. He has a blog now with over 1 million monthly unique visitors. He has a wealth management company in Manhattan and a column with Bloomberg and the Washington Post. And you hear that rattled off. And particularly for someone younger like us, that is intimidating. That is a list of accomplishments and credentials. You just say, like, how the hell would I ever do something like that? But then you break apart a story like his and you realize he started as a humble trader on a trading floor, and he just took really diligent notes about, what he learned each day, the mental mistakes that he was making, that he was seeing other people make. And the notes were so good that other people kind of around him wanted to see them. So they got passed around, and he realized that they got passed around, another degree of separation outwards to people he didn't even know who they were. That signaled to him there was a demand for what he was doing. He set up a shitty GeoCities website in 1999 iterated on that website, on his writing, on all that stuff. And 10 years later, he's this overnight sensation with all these credentials that I rattled off a little bit earlier. And that is the part that never really gets celebrated. And I mean, personally, I think why we're both attracted to podcasting in general is you get to break apart and add a bunch of context beyond that first sentence of your byline or, what'll be written in the first sentence of your obituary. You actually get to provide that context.
Yeah, it's always remarkable when you talk to people like that. And after even just a few minutes, you kind of come to that realization that they're just people like you, and they've probably been in the game longer and built up certain accomplishments. But at the end of the day, they have a lot of the same fears, concerns, desires, worries. And that's always, I don't know, I find it very motivating where you see somebody from the outside and they're super impressive, super built up. And then you get to know them and it's like, oh, okay, they've just, worked really, really hard at this and they've earned that prestige, but they're not that different from any of us.
Right. They're humans and they might be a little bit more diligent than you, a little more organized, a little bit more hardworking, but it's a human. It's not an alien with a completely different set of abilities. And that specifically for an audience like yours that is younger, like it should give you hope and make you excited to realize you're just at the beginning of your journey. There's a lot of steps that are coming down the pipe. And if you lay that foundation now, there's going to be some fantastic opportunities that come your way.
Definitely. What were you doing when you started the podcast?
So I was, this ties nicely into the kind of theme of your show. I graduated from school. I started selling insurance basically purely off of momentum. I was told this is a good job. I was told that it was entrepreneurial. I didn't necessarily do that research that one should be doing when they're kind of charting their career path. And less than a year into the job, I was kind of feeling lost. I actually, like the first week, I was stressed out and my girlfriend asked me, if you could do anything in the world and money was no object, what would you do? I said, I'd host my own podcast. And I didn't know that was my answer to that question. That came out of me without me really knowing that was my answer. And so that kind of stewed around in the back of my head for 8 to 10 months. I did research on what it took to launch a podcast, your natural, just being busy, kind of dragging things out. But basically after 10 months, I decided I'm going to do this. Like now is the time. Now is the time when I have the most freedom, when I can take a risk, when I can go for it and build a skill set. And there really aren't that sort of crazy expectations for someone at my age. Anyways, I was 23 years old. And, for people not familiar with the financial services industry, it's very highly regulated and the big organizations are very conservative. They're very worried about, some of them should be more worried, but they're very worried about regulation and getting fined or, getting suspended, getting their license removed for nefarious behavior. So they're very conservative on any sort of outside business activity. They don't want another Bernie Madoff who's embezzling money. So every outside business activity you have to register. So like when I was playing Semi-Pro Ultimate and getting, whatever, $50 game check or something, I had to register that. Like, I'm also getting money from this source in addition to other ones, which is in many ways counterthetical to the notion of being entrepreneurial and having that kind of freedom to do with what you want. But I basically, said, I'm going to start this podcast. I didn't even, in hindsight, I was a little naive to just say I should be disclosing everything and, they're on my side as they tell me. But they basically said, we can't approve this. We won't allow you to do the podcast. We'll revisit this in 3 years. Not even we'll let you do it in 3 years. We'll revisit this in 3 years. So as a hothead like myself would do, I went out to my car and I screamed as loudly as I could and decided that I was going to quit. I talked to a couple, mentors, and they basically said, take the weekend, calm down, think about it. Don't make a purely emotional decision. And I came in the next week and I handed in my resignation and started recording. I think I'd already recorded a few episodes. So that's kind of like that gray line of I decided I was going to do this. I wasn't necessarily exclusively waiting for approval, but I had some episodes ready to go. Like I knew this is what I was going to do. And then basically just put in the resignation and got to work.
That's pretty ballsy. What were you doing for money then?
Well, I've always been, being an economics student and being in financial services, I was a very, very good saver. So I had some runway. And I also just kind of have, you could call it an arrogance. I think of it as a practicality. Like you can find a job, right? Like 95% of the population is employed. or something. That's not a perfect number, but you get what I mean? Like, unless you really think so lowly of yourself that you are in the bottom 10% of all human beings from just a pure ability standpoint, which I can't imagine anyone listening to this podcast would be, you're going to be able to get a job. It might not be the dream job, but if you really get in that tight of a spot, you can figure something out. So I knew I had some savings. I knew I had the creativity and the drive and the network to some degree to make something happen. And I also knew that doing the podcast was going to create access to a whole new set of opportunities that otherwise wouldn't be there. So to give you some examples of that, like I've been solicited to co-found companies with people, to come in as like a chief marketing officer for these different companies and actually turn those down. Like I can't even imagine turning those down 2 years ago. But now I'm in this completely different place where, because of the work that I've shown, and it's not necessarily a resume, but this website that I've built and this brand that I have for myself, that I just have access to a different opportunity set that I otherwise wouldn't.
And when you were starting it out, how did you figure out how to do a good job with it? Because a lot of people, I mean, you were being very kind earlier in saying that I do a good job with research, but a lot of people, they kind of like throw their podcasts together, I find. I've gone on a couple where we get on and they're like, oh, hey, what are we talking about today?
Oh, yeah, man. I did this one interview. Where I could hear her reading off my bio from my website for the first time. Oh. And she was like butchering it. Like she was misreading. She couldn't read for comprehension. And it was just like, what do you do? Like, this is a complete disrespect to me. Forget a waste of time. Forget the fact that any like reasonable consumer of content is not going to spend 13 seconds on this. Yeah. But it's just disrespectful to not have a base level of preparation. Sorry, I cut you off there though.
No, you're good. So how did you learn how to do it back then? Because it's definitely easier to find that content now. And you, I think, were kind of early on this. So what were you doing to learn more about being a good interviewer and everything?
Right. So just taking things back to a real base level, I was raised on NPR. I got into the car after school when I was sixth grade, and NPR was on. It wasn't pop radio, it wasn't anything else. So that's, some deep subconscious level kind of ingrained in how I think about the world. And additionally, I'd been listening personally to podcasts since like 2009, 2010. So part of what prompted me to start was I was listening to hours of podcasts per day, walking to and from class, anywhere, at the gym, wherever I was. And I got to the point where I was listening to interviews and I was wishing they'd have gone in a different direction. They'd stumble over a question or go one way, like, no, you needed to dig deeper into that. Like I needed more information on that topic. And so it was really about scratching my own itch of like, I want to create the show that I can't find. I want to create the show that I can't hear. And that is another, when it comes to just creating anything, fundamental distance that you have to travel, which is you'll start off with a vision for what it will be. And you just don't have the skill set. You don't have the experience. You don't have the fluency and the nuances. But if you just continue to put in the work, and if you actually have that vision and that taste for what it's going to be, because a lot of people start with any sort of creation like that with it's just very, very broad. They don't have a specific, I don't want to necessarily like solution that they're trying to create, but a specific task or thing that they're trying to build. And if you come into it with that and a basic sensibility about the medium and what it takes to be good, then you're just going to have to iterate and iterate and iterate until it gets to be something that's pretty solid.
And how did you get those first few guests when you were just starting out? Because you came into it with no real audience or anything, right?
None whatsoever.
So how did you show that like some value when you were reaching out?
So that's the other thing, this being a young audience is you can leverage your youth. People feed off of someone who's young and hungry because that's something that starts to fade out of people, or they maintain it and then they're still just looking for other like-minded people and they know that that's more likely to be found in someone who's young and hungry. So you have to have tact. I get hit up now for people who want me to, promote them on social media or do these other things. And it's very, like lacking in just basic emotional IQ. Emotional EQ.
Emotional intelligence. Yeah. EQ.
Yeah, emotional intelligence. But in general, my skill set in selling insurance and the training they give you for anything you want to say about insurance sales, they teach you how to sell. And all I was doing was translating the frameworks and the language there into a much much easier sale. Instead of, hey, give me all your personal financial information. Let me put together a financial plan for you. Let me put you into this financial product. I was saying, hey, let me come to you, or let's meet. I'll record your story and you talking about yourself for 30 to 45 minutes and then share it with an audience. And I wasn't going after like the biggest names in the game. Like, that's a terrible pitch if you're going to go try and get Seth Godin or someone. They need more skin in the game than that. But to a lot of people, like a lot of very interesting people, that is enough, because number one, they feed off of your hunger. You say, even if you're not young, I'm hungry. I'm trying to make this thing. They feed off of that. Two, we're egotistical beings. We love to talk about ourselves. I'm on this show because I get a certain thrill out of telling my story and sharing it with people. Hopefully I can deliver value through doing that, but there is a selfish component to it. And then, basically, it's also going to build awareness for whatever project you're working on or your business or whatever it may be. Even if it is, when you start off 75 or 100 people listening, that's a classroom. I've interviewed Russ Roberts, who is the host of Econ Talk. He gets tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of downloads now. But he was a professor at George Mason in the economics department. And the first time he started, which was even earlier than me, I think it was like 2008 or something, someone said, you could have like 300 people listening to a podcast. What's that worth? And he said, I lecture in classrooms of 100 people, 150 people. So you're telling me all I have to do is record my voice and I can reach double my existing classroom. So when people, get this ego about audience size and all this other stuff, I just come back to that. Like the average podcast, I think the guy who runs Libsyn said it was like 150 listeners for the average business podcast, maybe even less. It's like people get, their panties in a bunch over that, when that is still a ridiculous amount of people actually caring about what you have to say and listening to you, giving you 30 minutes of their time to listen to your conversation and your point of view. I mean, that's powerful. So I kind of forget the initial question, but I feel like that hopefully was helpful.
It definitely was. And there was an idea in there that I think is worth unpacking, where you talked about reaching out to people who have not had that exposure to large audiences. And I feel like everyone gets kind of trapped by this, where the first people you think of trying to reach out to are the ones that you know of or that you've heard of, which are probably the ones who are writing blogs or hosting podcasts or going on the news. And they get so much inbound, like you said, right? But if you reach out to people who aren't doing that, it's so much more meaningful, and they're not already inundated with a million requests for their attention, that it's really easy to get a response and start building a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is there's these circles of influence that are waiting to be tapped. So I'll give you an example in the Ultimate Frisbee world, right? There were 2 professional Ultimate Leagues. It's down to 1, and it's called the American Ultimate Disc League. And I think they're at about 24 teams right now. And in terms of scratching my own itch, I wanted to figure out who's crazy enough to buy an AUDL franchise and try to make professional Ultimate Frisbee happen. Like, I don't even know if you were aware of it before you came across any of my stuff. Most people aren't. And that massive task of trying to make this new professional sport exist, to me, is just this next order of magnitude level of difficulty than a traditional business, which is already terribly hard, of a coffee shop or whatever, the widget factory. Those are, at least there's some sort of pre-existing model. Starting a new sport is so difficult. So I wanted to speak to these entrepreneurs and just see what was up. And they aren't getting interviewed anywhere else. I have searched maybe one person on one show one time, but there is nowhere else you can go to access that circle of information. So if you go on my site now, I think there's like 15, 20 interviews with AUDL owners. And one of my questions in like every single one is, so why would you do this? Like, what was your initial, and it's also tied to finance, investing thesis? Like, are you thinking this is going to be a profitable business in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, ever? What are you willing to sacrifice? What's your background? Like, do you have the actual funds to see this thing through? And within the Ultimate community, that is something that has resonated with people, and they want to learn more, and they feel like it's this valuable resource to them. But there are countless circles of influence like this that are just waiting to be tapped with a unique story out there. Like that, there's also that notion that, well, what am I going to say? Like, how am I going to find my unique voice or my unique perspective? Is tap into a circle like that. Like, that pitch probably falls deaf on 80, 90% of listeners, but there's 10% of people who are like, yeah, what is up with someone who would do that? And I am meeting that need when no one else is.
I love that. And what do you want to do with it in the long term? Like, where are you trying to take it from here now that you're 250 episodes in?
I mean, the show in general. So like I've had people, I've actually had a few sponsors that I've kind of experimented with, and I do get solicitations there. But in general, I'm thinking of it in kind of a long-term branding influence play. The massive influencers out there are either starting their own companies or getting equity in companies basically for just being the marketing for them and sharing it with their audience. I see a similar future there where I can start a business and have 100 beta testers, 1,000 beta testers right off the bat, or just generally getting awareness for a new brand or a new company with a few social media posts. I think that is really valuable now, and it's only going to get more valuable in the future, just in terms of thinking about the attention economy and how many institutions are competing for that now. Like, I'm sure you've seen Netflix is raising their budget from 5 to 7 billion. Amazon's over 3 billion. Apple's adding 1 billion. All these companies are just going after our attention because it is one of the resources out there with a definite finite supply. There's 24 hours in a day. You got to sleep for a few. That is going to be massively, massively competitive. And if I can establish an admittedly small beachhead relative to those behemoths, that's something that I can leverage into future business success.
Yeah, you're totally right there. That's what I always kind of give as justification for the blog and the podcast and stuff, is even if I don't have a specific goal with it financially or whatever at the time, it's like whatever you are going to do in the future, one, getting comfortable putting your ideas in a coherent format to share them, and then also having an audience that is interested in what you are talking about, are both just these incredible resources where instead of having to, for example, build out a whole product MVP, you can pre-sell it to your existing email list and just see who's interested before spending time building anything. And that's just amazing for testing any opportunities or ideas that you might have down the road.
Yeah, totally. And not only that, but think about the access question. So I've, used the equipment that I have here sitting in my basement to get the attention of, or get in the same room as, people who otherwise are not granting 30-minute meetings to 24-year-olds. Like, I interviewed Bill Peduto, the mayor of Pittsburgh. He is not granting 30-minute meetings with 24-year-olds. That's just like fundamentally a terrible strategy for remaining the mayor of a major city. And by having this equipment and having this show, I actually have the equity to leverage getting in that room, and what can be learned from that, the connections that can be gleaned from that, are just incomparable.
Yeah, definitely. Besides the podcast, when you started it, you were also doing VP of sales for Top Score, right?
Right.
So how did that come about? What was the story there?
That was the beauty of Pittsburgh Ultimate Frisbee. A fellow graduate of the University of Pittsburgh Ultimate Frisbee team, a couple years older than me, was the chief financial officer of the company. He was looking to build out the sales team. I had the sales training, the experience. I was willing to take a risk. I was steeped in the kind of sports ethos of the company. And the concept there was building websites for sports organizations. So the website for a national governing body like, say, USA Water Polo should be tied to the website for Pennsylvania Water Polo, which should be tied to the website for Pittsburgh Water Polo. And each player should have a profile that can seamlessly move between those different levels of the network. And the site should be super easy to do scheduling and payment processing and score reporting and all the other things associated with a sports organization that wouldn't necessarily be supported by a Weebly or a Squarespace or a Wix or some of those other kind of out-of-the-box website builders.
And I guess what made you interested in keeping on with it? And then, when did that role end? And what made you want to move on?
So I was traveling through Asia for the first 5 months of 2017, and that was partially, trying to sell the service to Asian sports organizations, Hong Kong lacrosse, Thai ultimate frisbee, Philippines have a massive ultimate frisbee group, and the opportunity to join Nathan came up. and it was basically too good to pass up. I'm a big believer. I know you've had Taylor Pearson on. Zach is also a proponent of just getting with the people who are a couple steps ahead in the journey of where you're trying to go and learning from them. And Nathan fits that bill to a T. He has a massive podcast, a really large social following, successful exit in a business, and on and on down the line. And the opportunity to kind of be his right-hand man and manage a bunch of his business and see kind of behind the curtains how everything's working has been just massively educational. It's cut my learning curve in half. And that's really what led to me pursuing it.
Where did that role come from? How did he find you? Did he reach out or did you apply?
No. So that is the beauty of being in the right places at the right time. I was in all the podcasting Facebook groups. He posts, "Hey, I'm looking for someone to book guests for me." I say, "That needs to be me," was the first response to his post. And, we had a couple conversations. He kind of did a test run. He's like, "All right, book 15 people this month for me." He does a daily show. So that is a pretty important task for him. I did it to an adequate degree, and we slowly ramped that up until it was a full-time gig.
Cool. Yeah, and now you're balancing that on top of the Frisbee and your own podcast, and you guys do it all remotely?
Yeah, it's all remote. We've actually never met face-to-face. We were supposed to be in Austin at the same time 2 months ago, and plans fell through. But yeah, it's been a hustle, and I learn a lot from him and his just the way he thinks about things. I would say that I wouldn't even necessarily call it a weakness, but I'm kind of a contemplative, sit back, let things happen, and then push my chips all in. And he's much faster than I am. He's very to the point, direct, and executes really, really well, which is just practiced from running a business since he was 19. But that's just been a big learning curve for me.
Yeah, well, it is cool too how you can work with really smart people around the world and never have to meet face to face. I mean, one of the first projects that I really worked on, my partner / mentor at the time, Justin, we had not met for 5 months into the project until we were finally launching the thing. And I flew out to SF for us to do some in-person work together. But, and I've worked with a lot of people too, who've worked for me, who we've just done everything online. It's pretty cool that we're able to do that now. And to your point earlier, it makes it so much easier to build relationships with people you would have never had access to before if you can be comfortable doing everything remotely.
Yeah, I mean, working with Nathan is what has given me the confidence to try and start bringing in interns for what I'm doing. And literally, I think 2 meetings after this one we're having, I'm trying to bring my first intern on and have them kind of help with some of my processes. And I would have never had the confidence to do it this soon if it wasn't for Nathan's massive organization of freelancers and people, fulfilling very specific small tasks for him and just kind of rethinking the way an organization can be structured.
Yeah, so let's talk about college a bit, though, because it seems like you went the normal route for that first year or so and then deviated pretty quickly. So what were you studying in college that you ended up in insurance sales?
So I started in political science, and I was lucky enough to have a political theory professor make the joke, but there's, as often is the case, within a joke is some real wisdom. He said, "What does someone who graduates with a political science degree say at work?" And the whole classroom just "What?" He goes, "Welcome to Wendy's. May I take your order?" And a little funny, but the truth there is that not many people are beating down the doors trying to hire political scientists. And so that mirrored with the fact that just through these classes I was taking, you realize that economics are driving all of these decisions that the politicians are making. So I started studying economics, and basically that led into really being fascinated by finance, reading all these finance blogs, really genuinely getting into insurance sales, thinking that this is my avenue to helping people, save better and make good financial decisions, and quickly becoming disillusioned with that notion in the current form of the financial advice industry.
And when you were in college, were you doing some of this entrepreneurial type stuff on the side too, or did it really start after you got interested in the podcasting?
So technically no, but I, in hindsight, see where the entrepreneurial comes from in college. I always say I got my degree in political science and economics, but I got my master's in ultimate frisbee. So ultimate frisbee is not, an NCAA sport. Like our coach was a full-time elementary school teacher who came to practices afterwards and was an alumni of the team and just loved the sport. But I had to go to the student government board and solicit funds to help our players avoid the season. I negotiated with different ultimate frisbee apparel companies to sponsor our jerseys and make that decision and get the most value for the team that way. I had to organize the leadership of the team. You guys are going to be mentors. You guys are going to be in charge of our social media. You guys are going to be in charge of just organizing practices and making sure everyone's there on time. And you're going to be in charge of the workout plans. And so that was, in hindsight, very entrepreneurial. And there was a lot of leadership that went into that because you're deciding, you're making all this decisions yourself. There is no central authority that you're leaning back on. But there wasn't necessarily, I wish I could have started my podcast when I was, a sophomore or junior. I can't imagine where I'd be now. I do afford myself that daydreaming every once in a while, but that was the entrepreneurial venture in school.
Yeah, it's cool how everything kind of comes back to ultimate frisbee with you. Have you ever considered finding a way to build a business around that?
So there is, I wish I could go into more detail. There is something that I am planning on launching next year that needs a little bit of a foundation to be built before I'm comfortable talking about it, but there will be more in that direction coming soon.
Okay, well, you'll have to let me know when that starts and we can come on and talk about that then.
Absolutely.
How did your parents react when you decided to leave this insurance job to start a podcast?
They didn't get it. They didn't even really understand what a podcast was. So that was a really fun explanation. It's like radio, but on demand, kind of like Netflix. Oh, wait, you don't use Netflix. You don't really know what I'm talking about. Like it was terrible. But I mean, so when I was doing my career search, like senior year, the standard, like go to the career fair and fill out your resume and apply to 20,000 places. I had this weird dinner with like a family friend who live in the same neighborhood as my folks and my dad. And they said, I wish you'd be smarter than me and start your own business, and really encourage you to do that. But it's really just this interesting generational divide where, I talked about my parents earlier in this interview. They got out, they made it by following the traditional path. They went to school, they graduated, even if it took them a little bit longer. That got them the better opportunity that allowed them to move to the upper middle class, upper middle class neighborhood. And that's why that's the advice that I was being given. But then they kind of look back and say like, wow, it's the people who are entrepreneurial that really took that next step beyond where I was. So they didn't necessarily have the toolkit to say like, this is how you do it, because it's not the path that they had taken. But he said that, and that's another one of the things that kind of unlocked it. I was like, okay, now I just need to kind of search this out, because he's saying like, my dad's not someone who often talks about like regrets. But he's like, I wish like you could figure out how to do this, because it's not the direction that I went and I would have liked to in hindsight. And so that was really a point where I started just kind of searching it. And when you start from square zero, it's actually not that easy to really grab a toehold on how to execute on something like that. And it takes years of listening to people in the space and trying experiments and trying to do things before you actually start to get some fluency and some awareness for how to execute as an entrepreneur, which is just going to be so valuable for this next generation.
Yeah, well, it's a weird spot to be in when you're just starting out, because it feels like all you can do is consume more information. And I feel like college kind of does that to us too, where we always think the answer is to study more, right? Was there anything that helped you get over that hump? Because it sounds like it was a challenge you had to deal with a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard when you're past the point, but like there's just basic things that you have to get comfortable with, which is, from a sales standpoint, like asking for the check or asking for someone to believe in you or invest in you or buy from you, and getting comfortable in that inherently uncomfortable situation. And I mean, it helps to believe in what you're doing. It helps to have passion for it, but that is something everyone has to get over. And then in terms of just being a creator and not being a consumer, that is a shift where it's baffling to me how much I used to be on the side of consume. And it's not that I'm not consuming, it's I'm very specific and limited and targeted in what I'm consuming, and how much is fluff that can just kind of be cut out. That's a waste, that's noise, that really isn't tangibly affecting your life if it is, it might be negative because it's taking away from your opportunity to do other things.
So what do you consume then? And what's your system for that?
Well, there's certain podcasts. I mean, partially, like, as I'm trying to get better as a podcaster, I'm consuming the other podcasts that I consider to be the best. So that would be Conversations with Tyler Cohen. That would be Invest Like the Best with Patrick O'Shaughnessy. That would be, Nathan's is fantastic as well. Nathan Latka's The Top Entrepreneurs is definitely something that if anyone's interested in being an entrepreneur, they should be listening to that. And then beyond that, I'm really on the biography kick right now. I've been told by people that that's, a kind of a phase that you grow out of and you move towards the kind of original text. That's like the next phase that I'm moving towards. But right now I just finished a biography of Samuel Zemurray, who was the Banana King. It's called The Fish That Ate the Whale.
That book's amazing.
That's so good. And yeah, just kind of appreciating the many disparate paths that entrepreneurs of the past have taken and starting to recreate your model for a career. So you'll never get like a step-by-step approach that you might in a large organization where they say, well, first you're an associate, then you're an assistant manager, and then you're a manager, and then you're a VP, and then you're a yada, yada, yada. It's never going to be that clear, but you start to see, oh, he started with one little stand and then he, found the capital to make 3 more. And then he realized that he had a supply problem. So he went to the farm, and like you start to understand how these really successful people have pieced things together. And then that's when you start to see the path for yourself. But then you just have to go execute. You can see it, and then you have to take that step into executing and not really giving a crap what other people think or say about you.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the great things about reading stories. And I recently read The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell. I don't know if you've read it, but he talks about this idea a lot, how when you have all of these stories in the back of your mind, whenever you encounter new situations, you will intuitively apply some story from your memory that you're familiar with to that situation, and it will help you work through it. And one of the benefits of mythology is that it's focused on these big grand issues that can help you process these big grand problems. And then I find biographies are so useful, like you said, because then you get these stories of how these other entrepreneurs did it in other similar situations. And then when you run into problems that in whatever ways mirror what they did, or you start to feel things that they felt, it's so easy to go back to what they did in that situation and then project it onto what you're doing now.
Right. I totally agree. And you see all these people get successful by not necessarily breaking all the rules, but not just being completely beholden to them, where you see someone who was willing to sacrifice and live in a more conservative home or dress a little bit more shabbily, but that gave them the capital to invest in the thing that they were completely focused on. It gives you those models and shows you what it takes to be successful.
Yeah. Have there been any really pivotal books in your life, like ones where you kind of look back and you can see the delineation before you read that book and after you read that book?
So one of the books, I don't know if it's necessarily appropriate for like an older audience, but when I look back at my childhood, there was a book called The Gospel According to Larry, which was kind of about anti-consumerism and not following the traditional path. Like that was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. And I feel like that definitely primed me for the kind of career that I've molded for myself now. But in terms of more recently, I feel like Anti-Fragile by Nazim Taleb is an absolute must read for anyone who has a basic understanding of kind of finance, statistics, numbers. It can definitely be over your head if you don't have the right foundation in place to understand all the language in there. But that is a game changer by all accounts, in my opinion. And then I really recommend also in terms of not only kind of working on that storytelling skill, but just understanding how things grow and evolve and giving that, really wide ranging or wide sweeping history of something from its nascent stages to its early years to its fully formed present or recent past. Anything by James Andrew Miller. So he wrote the oral histories of Saturday Night Live, ESPN, and CAA, which is the creative artist agency, the biggest agency. They've powered Hollywood and popular culture for the last, 30, 40 years. And he just does a fantastic job of profiling the kind of initial entrepreneurs who made this happen, but also adding in the context of the other kind of people who are playing in that space. So once you do build something and there are kind of people coming after your organization, your power, your influence, how do you manage that? Like, what's been the downfall of some people? What's allowed them to prosper and last a really long time? And those have been really influential on me.
Yeah, Anti-Fragile for me is probably top of that list right now. Just absolutely phenomenal book. I haven't read any of the other ones you mentioned, so I'm gonna have to check those out after. How do you decide what to read? Because you give a recommendation every month, right, through your newsletter?
Yes, that is correct. I decide what to read. So, I mean, I have a couple people that I really trust their book recommendations. So that would be Mike Dariano. His website is The Waiter's Pad. That would be Patrick O'Shaughnessy. I mentioned his podcast, Invest Like the Best. I literally have his newest book recommendation newsletter waiting for me. It's going to be the first thing I read whenever we hop off of here. And in general, it's practice. It's like I don't know, 8-page document of books when I hear them. Oh, that's interesting. And then I kind of I go back and sort them and bring the ones that I'm really excited to read up to the top of the list. And then I don't know, I get drunk and go on Amazon and buy a couple. Like, I'd love to tell you it's like some really well-defined system, but it's usually kind of at my whim. And then, I have like 8 or 10 books sitting on the nightstand or on the dresser, and I kind of pick up the one that's really appealing to me at the moment. And then there's also a degree of, I have some guest on and I have to read their book. Like right now I'm reading Casino Healthcare by Dan Monroe because I'm going to be doing an interview with him next week. But that's, kind of a forcing function for reading. That's the other challenge is reading consistently, like what's forcing you to do it. And I found it really helps to have an imminent interview with someone whose book you haven't read, because that always helps.
Yeah, it's funny. My friend Neil and I started another podcast where that's literally what we do is we just take a hard book and read it and talk about it every week. And that has just been such an amazing forcing function, like you said, for reading these tough books that I might put down for something else instead and keeping it at a pretty aggressive pace too. Yeah. Any last thoughts or things that we haven't touched on that you wanted to talk about or share?
Well, I guess there's 2. Number one, if people are not at the very least educating themselves on blockchain technology and what's going on there, I'm far from a computer engineer, but not necessarily from like a speculative financial standpoint, but just the notion that it's going to be creating new business models and disrupting some things that we don't even necessarily consider institutions. But when you think about a company like Google being 20 years old and other things, like they are starting to become somewhat institutionalized. I think that that's something that everyone needs to be learning more about.
You've got a few episodes on it, right?
Yeah, that's one of the kind of subsections of my podcast that I've been exploring and trying to just learn as much as I can. I've read books like Internet of Money, Blockchain Revolution to kind of inform me there. But that's the big one. And then the other one is in general, but particularly if any of your listeners are from the greater Pittsburgh area, I'm going to be hosting an event in January 27th called the Going Deep Summit. And the idea there is that some previous guests of my show, like Leah Lizarondo, Ed Lattimore, Zak Slayback, who's been a previous guest of your show, Dan Bull, Adam Harridan, are going to be speaking there. It's going to be centered around basically just giving these really talented people the opportunity to step on stage and share their perspective and, try to hack the learning curve for more people. But all these people are quintessential followers of an untraditional path. And none of them took a stair-step approach. None of them followed the leader. They all kind of blazed their own trail. Leah Lizarondo started an amazing nonprofit called 412 Food Rescue that she's now scaling out of the greater Pittsburgh area, but it helps deliver food that would otherwise be thrown away as waste from a big shopping center like a Costco or a Sam's Club or a Target and take that to the food deserts of Pittsburgh where people are food insecure through a volunteer network of delivery people. Adam Harridan left a job as a nutritionist at Whole Foods and now has, as good of a career as a forager could possibly have, as a naturalist could possibly have, teaching people about the great outdoors, how to identify mushrooms, the medicinal benefits, and this kind of old education that we've lost as a people as we've retreated from nature. There's lessons and there's insights that he's going to share with people. So I am phenomenally excited about it. And I have a code for your audience to get a discount for tickets.
Nice. What's the code? Or we can put it in the show notes too. People know where to find this.
It's going to be Nat Chat, and I'll make sure you get the link for that.
Awesome. Thanks. And you didn't dive in on Ed Lattimore, but if anyone listening doesn't follow Ed on Twitter, you definitely should. He's like the most interesting philosopher boxer. Not that that's a huge category, but he just seems like a super interesting dude. I feel like he alone would be worth going to hear from. And he's in Pittsburgh as well, right?
Yep. So that's the other thing. All these people are kind of Pittsburgh based. And you have a little taste of this, but Uber, Facebook, Amazon, Google all have offices here in Pittsburgh. CMU is spitting out all this talent. And in general, there's this kind of notion that Pittsburgh is definitely not the next Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of tech talent here to be exploited. And part of the idea with this conference is let's get more people in on this beyond the computer programmers and the engineers. Let's talk about the other ways that you can be really innovative, deliver tremendous value, and craft a career path that otherwise wouldn't have been accessible in most previous generations. That
sounds like it'd be perfect for a lot of people listening. Where can people find more about you, the podcast, the conference, everything? Where's the main places you would send them?
So the website's goingdeepwithaaron.com, have all the information there. Obviously, people are listening to this now. Go into your podcast app, go subscribe to Going Deep with Aaron. That's the name of my podcast. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, Aaron Watson 59. And in general, I'm very often mixing it up with listeners and making specific recommendations for them. So I get a little bit of information about you. You say, hey, I'm really into, I'm a painter. I want to pursue this art career. Fantastic. Let me introduce you or share my episode with Baron Batch, who was a former Pittsburgh Steeler and started his own art studio after retiring from football and is doing really interesting things there. So making those kind of connections is what I'm all about.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, this is a lot of fun. I'm glad that Zach connected us, and I'll have to let you know next time I'm in Pittsburgh. Maybe I'll be able to get over there for the conference too.
Yeah, I would absolutely love that. And once again, I'm honored and very thankful for the opportunity to be on your show.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on, Aaron, and talk soon. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Nat Chat. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to Nat Chat in iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Second, if you're trying to take advantage of some of the information from this episode, be sure you check out the show notes at nataliason, nateliason.com/podcast, and find a friend, because implementing a lot of this stuff is much easier if you have somebody to do it with. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode and you've been enjoying other episodes of the podcast, please leave it a review on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your casts so that more people can find it. This is the best way for it to get some more exposure and to make sure that I can keep bringing these episodes to you. With that, thank you and have an awesome rest of your day.